This video is a representation of how I am going to work on my bike. That means that if I make a mistake, well, that's on me. Likewise, what you do to your bike, well, that's on you. Moving on to the rear brakes then. Slightly more complicated, but still perfectly doable. Okay, so the brake pads on the rear are held in with pins, but these pins are bolted into place. So the first thing we're going to do is loosen off the retaining pins, and then we can look at getting into the pads. You may have a cap on here which will need removing, and this is your main caliper retaining bolt. Loosen that off, but don't remove it just yet. And the reason why I said don't remove that bolt just yet is because I want you to see between the caliper bracket and this boot here, there's actually a washer, and that washer will drop off on you. The minute that bolt comes out, make sure you catch that washer. There's your washer. Next up, you remove your pad retaining pins. You may have noticed then when we removed the pad retaining pins, the caliper kind of moved up slightly, and that's because the caliper is designed to pivot at the front. Be careful when pivoting your caliper not to pivot it too far, because you will scratch your swing arm, which is what someone has done previously on this bike. And with the caliper pivoted at the front, it leaves the brake pads behind, and the inner pad just here, you can just slide it out backwards, and then the caliper will slide out slightly and you can remove the inner pad. At this point, of course, you can just replace the pads if that's all you're doing. Okay, rear wheel removal then. If you've not seen this before, you may find it interesting, because at the back, of course, we have the chain to contend with. And as the chain stretches, we take up that chain slack by moving the wheel backwards with the chain adjusters there. And so the wheel and the disc will move back. Only the caliper also needs to be able to move back with the disc, and that's where this caliper bracket comes in. Let's get this wheel off. Once again, I have put a couple of chocks underneath the wheel to stop it from dropping. Now, contrary to popular belief, you do not need to touch your chain adjusters in order to remove the back wheel. 19mm socket. Once the axle nut is loosened off, you will need to counter hold the axle from the opposite side with a 17mm. Whilst turning the axle nut on the right hand side. And then we can remove the axle simply by pushing it from this side and pulling it through from this side, waiting of course for the potential for the wheel to drop slightly. Then if you carefully remove that front chock, it will allow the wheel to move forwards and down until you get to a point where you can unhook the chain. And then the wheel can move backwards and out. This bracket is the bracket that the caliper sits on. And so as the wheel moves forwards or backwards to take up the chain slack, this whole bracket, including the caliper, move along with the wheel and the disc. And this bracket literally slides forwards and backwards. On that there, this is where the bracket actually sits, and it just, as I say, slides forwards and backwards, so that the wheel, the disc and the caliper can all move backwards and forwards at the same time. Now, the rear wheel does have a spacer on the disc side and a larger spacer on the drive side. Now, anytime that I'm handling my rear wheel, something that I want to show you, your rear sprocket here with its bearing and its hub, this whole, what I would call a drive assembly, it is literally just press fitted into place by hand. So whenever I'm handling my rear wheel, I like to remove this, even if I'm doing nothing with it. In this case, we're about to take off the disc. If you don't remove this, it'll just drop off and land on your foot, no doubt. Okay, rear disc removal, pretty much the same as the front. And I have had this disc off before, so hopefully this one comes off a lot easier than the front. There you go. So when it comes to fitting your new disc, or in my case, refitting the old one, you're going to need thread lock for your disc bolts. I've already thread locked mine. A torque wrench set to 18 Newton meters. And one thing that I like to do is to grease a certain area, because you can just refit the disc just like that, bolt it on, done. But when I had to hammer the front one off, I'm not looking to do that again. So if we were to just bolt that back on like that, it would work fine. But it could get stuck again, because the aluminium and the steel, they react with each other and the disc gets stuck on. So I like to just put the tiniest bit of grease just on these mounting faces here. And I really do mean like the smallest amount. Like, you're not looking for huge amounts here. You just need just enough to create basically a barrier. It's not like we're trying to grease something in the normal way. You just want to create a barrier so that the two metals don't react with each other. Now, when it comes to fitting brake pads, take a look at where the pad touches the caliper, or if you're fitting old pads back onto the vehicle, it's even easier, because I can see here exactly where this pad touches the caliper. In this case, it's not just these two areas here, it's this area here and this area here. So you're going to want to get some grease of some sort on there, preferably specific brake grease, but if you haven't got that, then copper grease will do. And that's the contact points greased up. The mounting pins will go through these two holes, and the pins themselves will also be greased. Now then, whilst the front pads are pretty self-explanatory, the rear setup is a little more complex, a little bit fiddly even. Great piece of engineering, but I'm going to try and show you one or two things to do with the rear pad setup here. Now, both your inner and outer pads have these two holes at the top of them, and that's where your retaining pins are going to slide through. The inner pad literally sits on that pivot point there, and the other pivot point here comprises of the caliper retaining pin. So you've essentially got three pins. You've got your pad retaining pins, two of them, and then you've got your caliper retaining pin, which will go through the caliper. This is your main mounting point, and it will double up as your second mounting point for that pad. So that's how the inner pad looks when it's in place. The outer pad sits on this bracket itself. So when it's in place, that's how it looks. It sits on the bracket and it sits up against the piston. The piston. There's one of the retaining pins. Fitting the outer pad to the caliper first, you've got your two retaining pins that I'm just holding in here, and the outer pad just literally just sits there like that. But you do have to kind of push it in slightly in order to take up the spring. And then I've got one of them in. One of those retaining pins has gone straight in. The other one, a little more reluctant, but that's how it ends up looking. So you've got your two retaining pins essentially holding that pad in place, and then you can slide the caliper onto its retaining pin. And you have to be careful, because you slide this on too far and your pad's not going to go where it needs to be. Your pad needs to be down here. Caliper and pad in place. The inner pad is more complicated, because essentially it needs to hook here. This piece needs to hook into that mounting point, which is just over there. But you can't just slide it in, it has to go in at a bit of an angle. So you slide it up at an angle and it hooks just onto the pivot point just there. So that's it hooked into place. and then you bring the pad up at the rear here, get it roughly into place there, and then you'll know if it's in place because the retaining pins will push through the inner pad like that. Now that pad's not going to drop out, and then you can get your main pivot point, mounting point back in place here. Remembering that washer. Once again, I stored everything kind of in place so that nothing got lost and nothing was dangling. You've got two wheel spacers, big fat one on the left next to your cog and the smaller one on the right next to your disc. I would suggest that you get some grease onto your caliper bracket sliding point there, and then just clean up and grease your axle. Okay, so everything is kind of lined up now. Both spacers are in place, the disc is sitting nicely between the two pads, and everything seems as though it's reasonably well lined up. Axle is cleaned and greased, so let's have a go at pushing this through. And now that the wheels are back on, we can tighten up the mounting bolt to 48 Newton meters and the pad retaining pins to 18 Newton meters. To tighten up your rear axle nut, you may need to counter hold it and turn it on one side or the other just until it's reasonably tight, and then you can torque it to 85 Newton meters. Good job I was holding the bike then, wasn't it?